Okay, welcome. I'm Mother Leslie Stewart of Resurrection Episcopal Church. Last week, we discussed the walk to Emmaus as one of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. This week, we're discussing the 7 disciples by the Lake of Galilee, which occurs a few weeks later, and that's John 21, verses 1 through 25.
Right.
It's, in here on the chart that we've been using, it's the 7 disciples by the Lake of Galilee. It's also known as the breakfast by the lake, breakfast by the sea, things like that. So I'll start by reading the passage, and we'll take it from there. John 21. Here we go. Jesus appears to the 7 disciples. It's what it's called. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberius, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together with Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net into this right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he had said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die. But if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written.
Wow.
The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting passage, and there is a lot going on here. I have never been to the Holy Land. Have any of you been to the Holy Land?
Ephesus
Yeah.
was as close as we got. Yeah.
One of the things, so I really like Father James Martin. He is a Jesuit, and he has this wonderful book called Jesus, a Pilgrimage. He leads pilgrimages over to the Holy Land, and it's really funny. It's about, there's like these little colorful stories about him and a companion of his as they went over and toured all these different places in the Holy Land. But he's just a really great, warm Catholic priest character, and I really highly commend it to you. But one of the things that I learned from him is that it's all the same thing. So he said the first time that he went to the Holy Land, he was expected to see these three great sites: Lake Gennesaret, the Sea of Tiberius, and the Sea of Galilee. Only to find out when he got there that all three of those referred to the same place. And so they think that the Sea of Tiberius was called that by the Romans. That was like a Roman name for it. Tiberius was a major character for them. But the Sea of Galilee and Lake Gennesaret, those are more Hebrew terms. So that is interesting. And then who is there in this passage? We have the sons of Zebedee, and I think this is the first time that John refers to them that way, James and John. And then we have the Galileans.
Thomas.
Yeah, Thomas, Nathanael. They are among the Galileans, people that Jesus gathered there around the lake there at the beginning of John's gospel. So Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, the fisherman, Nathanael, whom they went to go get, Thomas, and two other disciples that aren't named, but there's 7 of them. And then why are they fishing in Galilee, do you think? This is a couple of weeks after the resurrection. And it says that they have gone fishing.
Well, they're in hiding, right?
They're just
Well-
going back to their old ways.
Yeah,
They got nothing better to do.
right.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Also in Matthew 28, when Jesus appears to Mary and there are the angels there, they tell her, hey, go tell your brothers to go to Galilee and Jesus will see them there. So it could be that they are waiting, and they've been waiting for a couple of weeks now. Or it could be that they've gone back to the start of their story. This is where he had found them. Or it could be that they have given up and they are returning to what they had done previously. And all of this kind of transpires. It takes place in the early dawn. It was already dawn, it says. And there are a couple of resonances, as we call them, in this passage of scripture. So they've been fishing all night, and that should remind you of somewhere else in the gospel. There's a miraculous catch of fish. You guys remember that story? So Jesus has been this way with Peter before.
Right.
And that passage happens in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And in that passage, it's a similar thing. They've been fishing all night. Jesus calls them, says, you ain't gotten anything, put the net down. And they're like, nah, I don't want to. But because you ask, Lord, Peter says to him, I'll do it. And he has this miraculous catch of fish. And that's where Peter makes his first profession of faith, that this is the Messiah, the risen Lord. The Messiah, the Christ, is what he says in that passage in Luke 5, 1 through 11. So this is a resonance there. And then also the fact that they say that this happens around dawn is supposed to kind of be a resonance with Easter morning, that passage. And Jesus says to them, children, have you caught anything to eat? As it says in one version. But I like the NRSV version because it is closer to the Greek. Hold on, let me scroll back to that. Cast it on the right side of the boat and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. Hold on. Well, no, I can't find it. I've lost it again.
It's verse 5.
Thank you. I was there. I was so close.
You have
Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? So, and they were like, no. So in the Greek, it's called a ma. It's a little symbol that puts it in the negative. And so what he's saying is, I know you haven't caught any fish. You don't have any fish, do you? And that's what it says in the NRSV. And no, they do not. And it's interesting because, and I'm like beside myself because I realized I just had to like rearrange all of my books and bookshelves and stuff like that. And so I'm going to give you a reference, and I went to go actually get the book to hold up the book to show it to you, and I fear I can't find it now. And I fear that I gave it away in the culling of my books, and I'm like so distressed all afternoon.
Oh, no.
It happened.
But there is a book called the Sacropagina. It's the Gospel of John, and in it, Francis Maloney, it's his commentary, and he makes this really beautiful point that I really hadn't read in any other commentary. It's the first time that from Jesus's mouth he calls the disciples children. It's pedia in the Greek, and it's kind of an intimate authority term. And then he continues by doing really intimate things in this passage. You know, what does he do for these distressed people? I mean, not only does he bring in a haul of fish, but he makes them breakfast. You know, I don't know about you, but that really resonated with me because that's one of the first things that I did for my children first thing in the morning was to make them breakfast.
And Mike's one of your children, right?
Yeah. But no, many of you don't know that I'm actually a stepmother as well. So I've had other children besides Ryan. Maybe someday you'll meet them. And so he says, you know, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and they do. And they cast it over, and the net not breaking
That's big.
It's kind of a symbol of the expansive reach of the church, right? That's according to Father James Martin. That it's that we can haul them all in. You don't have to worry about it. The net doesn't break. What else? And then here is the really important line. So as you know, we're trying to marry up. I mean, this study is practicing resurrection. So it's not just that we look at the scripture and we take a look at all of these appearances of the post-resurrected Lord, but also what practices can we take on? What spiritual practices or prayer practices can we take on that help us live this resurrected life?
Mother, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in this passage, as we followed last week, they still did not recognize him.
Right.
Yeah.
As he asked the question, have you not caught any fish? But then it was Simon Peter that whom Jesus loved and says, it is the Lord.
Actually, it was not Simon.
It was not Simon.
It was not Simon. It was the disciple whom Jesus loved, whom they believed to be John.
Oh, okay. So it was John, because my Bible is the NIV Study Bible, Zondervan. And so that's what it says.
It says that it was Simon Peter that...
It said, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord.
Right. So the one whom Jesus loved, who they think is John, said it to Peter.
Said
But
it to Peter. Okay,
Yes.
thank you for the clarification. Yeah, so it was John. So
But
John there in the boat.
yes, but it's that's a really important point, because the spiritual practice that I want us to talk about this week is spiritual friendship. Okay, so there's a lot, of course, that we can learn about being in a small group. Everything that Jesus did was in community, and he had this small group of 12 disciples, and they did life together and all of that. But there's something different about friendships versus acquaintances or other people that are kind of on the fringe of your life. And remember, in John, it's a really big deal in the Gospel of John, back in chapter 15, when he says to them, I have called you friends, right? I have shared everything with you. I have told you everything. I've called you friends, is what he says to all of the disciples. But there's still noted throughout scripture that he had a special inner circle of friends, that he had a special spiritual friendship with. And anybody know who those three insiders were?
Peter, Andrew, and James, and John.
James and John.
Yeah.
And I don't think the third one was Andrew.
John, Simon, Peter, and
Yes. And
Matthew.
James.
Peter,
James.
Andrew, James, and
Yep.
John.
And so they were the ones that, like, he let them see. They got to come closer, and they got to be involved in some really high points, like the Transfiguration. They came up on the mountain with him, right? And some people think like that experience really marks John. Like he called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Like he just could not get over that intimate relationship that he experienced. He begins his gospel with reference to that experience that he witnessed in the Transfiguration. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. There is something different about spiritual friendships, and I want us to spend some time, and later towards the end of our lesson, kind of talking about that. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. I get very frustrated with a lot of the evangelical churches miss something. So much of what we do in the spiritual life gets distorted by doing instead of being, right? So it was a trend in a lot of evangelical churches a long time ago. They wanted you to have these close, intimate partnerships where you would just get with one or two other people. And in particular, they would talk about this with men, but they wanted them to call them accountability groups, right? It's all about our doing. Like you're supposed to get together and talk about how well you were doing at stuff. Talk about your sin, how pure were you, whatever. That's not what spiritual friendships are about. But it is really important that we have these little smaller groups that we can share life with. And more than that, we share our story with God with them. So I have a few more notes on the passage, but I definitely want to come back to that. Anybody know why I would have, I've read the passage to you so far. Any guesses as to why I paired spiritual friendship as the practice for us to take on this week, in light of this passage?
Well, the groups of 10, if we're going to adapt to the new lifestyle, what's happening, you have small groups that
Yeah.
is very appropriate.
Yeah, in the life of our church, we're going to take on some of these smaller groups as that opportunity. That's true. And what about related to this passage in particular?
Well,
Anything?
one of the things that you haven't talked about, but they spent a lot of time, was starting at verse 15, where he kept asking Simon Peter, do you love me?
Yeah, that's so
And
interesting.
I'm like, that has to have a lot of meaning. And I'm kind of like Simon Peter going, hey, you already asked me this. Are you not listening? Now, I know his response changed, feed and different things, but he asked the same question.
He asked it 3 times.
I know.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Yeah,
the,
and
that's
it's
the
kinda like-
connection, right? It's
Yeah, is that the friendship, the intimate friendship? And I'm like,
Yes. Yeah.
so let's talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. Very
well,
good
there's also
insight.
the denial, right? He denied him 3 times.
Right.
And
That's
so it's
right.
kind of related to that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
great point.
that's exactly what is happening in this passage. So this is, one of the signals of what's happening here is the charcoal fire. So let's break it down. What happens? Peter doesn't notice that it's the Lord, and as Laura noted, none of them really recognize him at first. This is this guy on the shore, and he's calling out to them. Something happens, though, by what he does, or what happens, what transpires, that alerts John, and John's eyes are opened, and he says, "It is the Lord."
Catching
And
it.
again, we're seeing that same kind of movement among the disciples and all of these post-resurrection appearances, where they move from like, "Oh, teacher," or whatever, to it's a very clear proclamation of "It is the Lord," and that is exactly what is said in the Greek. And so the signal is that there's this charcoal fire, and the last time that we see that is part of the Good Friday Passion narrative. The last time that we see Peter next to a charcoal fire, he makes his denial of Jesus 3 times. And so it's that exact same setting. He comes on the scene, and Jesus is making them breakfast, and they say fish and bread is what he's making there. And that's meant to remind us of a couple of things: the loaves and the fishes, right? They just reverse the order, so it kind of hides it a little bit from us, but they're talking about the exact same thing. And that he took the bread and he gave it to them. It specifically mentions those actions, which is that Eucharistic, part of that Eucharistic fourfold action that we talked about. We talked about this last week. Take, break, bless, break, and give. And so he does this very simple thing for these people who are suffering. He kind of has a little barbecue, basically, and makes them breakfast. And this place, actually, it's on the shoreline. That physical place is actually called the Primacy of Peter. And it's naming it that because this is the place where Peter is given a new commission. Before this, that first time, we're in the miraculous catch, in that story, that is where Jesus says, "I'm going to make you a fisher of men." And now we find him after everything has transpired. Peter is fishing, and he's with a bunch of dudes in the boat now. He's got a crew now. And now Jesus says to him, "Feed my sheep." And he says it in a couple of different forms. And the other thing that's interesting is that we have several words for love in the New Testament. That's a distinctive in these biblical languages that we kind of lose. Right? I can say I love pizza in English, and it has the same weight really in the language as me saying I love my husband. We lose something. But they had more words for it. And so the first 2 times that he asked him, "Do you love me?" it's agapeo, agape, which is like, do you love me for my best interest? Do you love me abandoning yourself? Yes. Okay. Well, feed my lambs, look after my sheep, whatever. But the last one,
he says, "Follow me."
Yeah, the last one is about the word that he uses for love is phileo, friendship. It places a very high value on friendship in the Gospel of John.
Right.
And again, it harkens back to John 15, where he says, "I have called you friends." It's the height of that intimate relationship with the Lord. And that's part of why I paired the spiritual discipline of spiritual friendship with this passage and this appearance. And I want to point out that it says specifically that he revealed himself. And the word they use for giving this revelation, it's a really important word in John's gospel. And it's not just the word that they use for like an appearance of Jesus in the post-resurrection appearance. It means a revelation that takes place in Jesus. It is an epiphany, a revelation. Does that make sense, that distinction? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So yes, very insightful for you all, but yes, there's a lot going on here. We're reinstituting, we're forgiving Peter. He's getting a public vindication. Just as he denied 3 times, he's being restored 3 times, which is part of his emotional response. The 3rd time he's asked, and he says,
Right.
you know everything, and you know that I love you.
Mhm.
And what I love so much is that this is the first time in the Gospel of John, this is the first time Peter is seeing the risen Lord. He has not seen him since Good Friday, when he denied him 3 times. And yet, when John, his friend, who has witnessed and walked with him and has seen his kind of experience with Jesus, he's seen kind of the language that the 2 of them share, he noted, oh, this is how Jesus is with Peter. I remember that giant catch of fish. And this exact same thing is unfolding again. It is the Lord. You know what I'm saying? Like John is Peter's spiritual friend. So even though even this physical place is called the Primacy of Peter, Peter is thought of, especially by the Catholic Church, of having primacy over all the other disciples because of this conversation that he has with the Lord. But really in the Gospel of John, an argument can be made that it's John that is given more authority than Peter. John sees the Lord sooner. He made it to the tomb faster. You know, in the Gospel of John, this beloved disciple character really does, he serves Peter, but also in a more authoritative way. Yeah, let's see. My dog is having a little fit over here. Hold on just a second. I'm going to mute you.
I know what that's like.
Because I don't know what's going on.
You're funny.
It happens, right?
Yeah.
Well, my dog was just fixing to bark out the window, so I thought we were going to disrupt everybody.
Well, is Conrad okay?
He is. He didn't want to come in his doggy door by himself. He wanted me to get up and open the door because he's
Oh,
not
that's so
meaning.
cute.
Share your patience.
Can I just say that you, and I've read this before, and I've read this in Greek before, but I don't know why it didn't sink in before, but you just cured like decades of bad evangelical exegesis of this passage between Jesus and Peter, because Jesus uses the word phileo. Do you love me? As you said, you know, Jesus used the word agapo twice. He said, do you love me in that kind of ideal sense? And Peter responds with, I love you as a friend, right? Phileo. And, you know, preachers made such a big deal when I was growing up about how we're not supposed to love Jesus as a friend. What Jesus wants from us is agape love. And that is exactly the opposite of what this passage.
No, you're right, because I've always heard the agape. But
You know, Jesus asked him twice, you know, do you have this kind of, you know, transcendent love for me? And Peter's like, dude, the best I can do is I love you, you know, I love you like I would love another person. And so in that third request, Jesus meets Peter where he is, right? He's like, okay, you know, I've asked you twice, are you, you know, do you love me in this abstract, supreme philosophical sense? And the answer is, I love you man to man. And so Jesus is like, okay, if you love me man to man, then love other people man to man. Do the same thing for others. And that's a really, I mean, I cannot tell you how many bad sermons I've heard that have argued what Jesus really wants from us is agape love for one another, when that's not what he's asking for us to do at all. He is asking for us to be friends to one another. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. He really does, in the Gospel of John, put a high value on friendship. And one of the things I love about Peter, and we all kind of get intuitively about Peter, is that he's a man in touch with his failings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like he really isn't at first. He's just kind of headstrong and and impulsive, and he doesn't have a filter and all of that.
And he's embarrassed by it,
He's always getting himself into a tight spot by what he just says or does impulsively. But here by the end, I've read several commentaries that say this is Peter in touch with his failings, right? This is him. The fact that he jumped in the water, there's a couple of ways that I've heard that preached, right? So like one of the things is, well, of course he wasn't afraid to jump in the water because when he'd been around Jesus before, he had walked on it. And that's true, right?
Now, do you see some of these things as just as symbolism, like the fact that, Peter was naked and then he had to get dressed and jump into the water? Well, that's what
He got dressed to jump into the water. That didn't make sense to me.
Well, I see that as symbolic, that he's really he doesn't have the comfort of God at that point.
No, he's
He doesn't want to be naked in front of him.
Yeah, and
per
then
se.
he's
Expose
preparing
himself.
himself.
yeah, and then he prepares himself to be with God.
Mhm.
There's something important in that statement. The symbolism.
When you look at the language, I am told that, in a couple of different commentaries break it down, that it doesn't mean actually that he was actually naked. It meant that he had nothing else on besides his outer garment.
Right.
They wore several layers, whatever. He probably had like a loose robe on or whatever. And the way that the language works, it sounds as if he kind of girded himself, like he either put his belt on, so, things wouldn't be his robe wouldn't have been all flopping around. He would have been able to swim. He did kind of make himself a little bit more presentable, but he probably wasn't totally naked.
Yeah.
Okay. But like you say, just more presentable for God.
No, Peter.
In my Bible that I'm reading, it says he put on his clothes for he was stripped for work. So yeah.
Stripped for work.
Interesting.
Because he was fishing, like a different presentation as a fisherman versus presentation.
The word is gymnos, like a gymnast. So I think, the idea of dress for physical labor, or, it doesn't say that he was naked, although gymnastics was a naked kind of sport in the ancient world, but it suggests dress for physical exertion, maybe, or just, he was ready for a day's work. But gymnos can mean naked, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Don?
Right.
You were going to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that the way I look at Peter is that we're talking about him and his emotional and coming together with his feelings, and so he's a fisherman at first, and that's all he was. And I kind of view him as a rock before Jesus said he was a rock, but not the same kind of rock. He was just, he's a hard working man, and when you get to the garden and you get to the crucifixion and Jesus' arrest and all that, then these feelings and emotion overcomes him, and he doesn't know how to reconcile that with being a rock. And here it kind of melds together, that this love, is compatible with being the rock upon which the church is built. And to me, it's almost as if here, for the first time, it's an aha kind of moment for him,
Yeah, I love that Peter didn't fear the Lord, that this is the first time he's seeing him since the denial and since the passion, and yet as soon as he hears that it's the Lord, he jumps right in and goes toward him. And I think it's because he had an assurance that he was loved by the Lord. And I love that the Gospel of John ends this way, right? Not with like this hero story of Peter the rock being the hero of the story and he did everything right. I don't know what hope that would offer us as we deal with our feelings. Instead, it ends with Peter being confronted by all of his weakness and failings and having that forgiven and restored, and him being reconnected with community. And I think that is a beautiful way to end the gospel.
I think in as much, if I may say, that he asks at the very end in verse 22, well, Jesus answers him, but he asks him, what about the one that betrayed you?
Yeah.
No,
That's a good-
that-
Betrayed you. What happened to him?
no, that's Peter asking about
That's the same
John.
person.
Yeah, that is Peter.
Yeah, so Peter is not, he doesn't ask about the one that betrayed Jesus. He's asking about John.
said, Lord, well, he had asked him before. He said, Lord, who is going to betray you?
Right,
And
that was John.
Peter saw him. He asked, Lord, what about him?
Yeah, he's quoting the passage from the Last Supper, and so he's pointing
Right.
to John,
Said before.
and he's quoting John at the Last Supper. John is the one who had
Correct.
asked the Lord, "Hey, who is going to betray you?" You know, so he's just really making sure that we understand who it is that we're talking about, which is John. Not that he betrayed him, but that he was very concerned that Jesus would be betrayed, and that's
Right.
really. I paid attention to that line too, Laura, because this is a story about restoring somebody who had done a terrible betrayal 3 times,
Yeah.
Right.
Nine.
you know, and how
Right.
interesting to pick that back up at the end of the story and say, you know, John also had forgiven Peter, right? Talk about spiritual friendship.
Right.
John at the Last Supper was so concerned with who is going to betray you, Lord.
Right.
And we know that Judas did, but we also know that Peter did. But
That-
John stayed a spiritual friend to him
You know,
and helped him identify the Lord in his life.
And to me, it goes with what you were saying. It's such a beautiful way for this story to end because Peter made mistakes, but he was forgiven for those mistakes.
And isn't that good news for us?
That is so powerful.
Well, and that's a lesson that we all can learn about forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
That, you know, people will do things and then regret that they did it.
Right.
So, you know, it's okay to forgive them
Right.
for making a mistake.
Right.
So a couple of things for us to take with us in this week, practices that we can take up. I want to talk a little bit about spiritual friendship because I don't know that you necessarily, if you haven't experienced, you may not know what I'm talking about.
I have.
A spiritual friend is, you know, it kind of models the love within the Trinity, right? And that's kind of what we see between Jesus and his closest disciples. I don't, even if you have just one spiritual friend, it's not just the two of you, it specifically is the two of you and the Lord, you know, that there's an awareness of each other's spiritual lives and your life with God, with one another. And it's helpful because you can help identify, just like John did for Peter, you can help identify how the Lord is working in your life. Because sometimes when you're in the midst of it, it's really hard to see. Like Peter, I mean, you've been waiting. He said, go to Galilee. We went to Galilee. It's been a couple of weeks. He hasn't shown up. I heard that a couple of other people have seen him. I haven't seen him yet. And so I've gone back to the beginning and I'm out here and I'm working hard all night. I haven't caught anything. I've even stripped off. I took my shirt off. I'm working so hard and nothing is panning out. And then it's your friend, you know, that can say to you, hey, it's the Lord. He's here. He's here. So any of you have any stories of spiritual friends? In particular, any that have helped you in a low time?
Not that I want to share on recorded video.
I understand. Okay.
Thanks for
Yeah.
reminding us, Laura, before
Thank
you all
you.
got really
I
deep
have-
into it.
I have experienced that, but yeah, you know, it'll be like a very intimate, private, you know, time in life.
Well, good. Then
I-
now I know.
I'm willing to share my story, Mother.
Okay.
Well, I think you are my spiritual friend, and I really believe that I think I was meant to meet you at a time in my life when I was a caretaker of my husband who was so ill. I was desperate for contact, for human contact. I was desperate for someone that could bless me and my husband who were alone. And if it hadn't have been for you, I don't know if the ending of my husband's life would have been as peaceful and as blessed if it had not been for you. You know, you came to visit me every single Sunday. I looked forward to it because that's all I had, was to look forward to your visits. My husband was so ill, and at the very end, you came even to visit us in the hospital. You came to give him his last rites. You prayed with my children, and you gave him probably, and you said it even in your eulogy at my husband's funeral, that if we were all to be so blessed as to have that ending in our lives. And for that, yeah, pretty much you were my spiritual friend. And I'm so eternally grateful. I always have been, and I always will continue to be.
That's beautiful.
And I still am, and you are to me too. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
It's
Well,
true.
there's nothing else can follow up that story. Oh my goodness, thank you, Laura.
What a beautiful story to end on.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't.
Oh my goodness. So what a gift you've been to me as well. I think it's a good thing to make a little list, a little timeline of the spiritual friendships that you've had, even no matter how long or short they were. Somebody that you could share your spiritual life with, your story with God with. And maybe just break your life down into 10-year increments and just make little notes of who came into your life then. Another practice you might take on this week is to draw a line down the middle of the page, and on one side you write down characteristics of what you think makes a good spiritual friend, and on the other side you write down how you feel like you're doing as a friend to people, right? A little self-reflection of, just to help you take an assessment of who could I be a spiritual friend to, and how am I doing with that? I have a really good friend. I've had a lot of spiritual friends that I've shared a lot of life with, and some that I didn't really think much about at the time. When my son was born, right after that, I was left alone a lot. My husband was out of town for like the first 10 months of our son's life, and I was in this place where I had no friends. I didn't know anybody, but I joined a mom's group here in Plano, and that was like the worst possible thing I could have done. These were not friendly people. Oh my goodness, it was one of the most lonely times of my life. But one of the things they did is they had a fashion show put on by a local hairdresser named Evelyn Kershaw. And they picked like the homeliest ones of us, the ones that looked like we were, struggling. And I was one of them that they picked. And they let us do a makeover with her. And so I got to spend time with her. And she shared a lot about her faith with me. And I was just returning to my faith at that time. And over about 20 years now, she and I have walked a lot of road together. And she is, one of the things about spiritual friends is that because they are so close to you and close to your heart, they can say things to you that other people cannot. Mm-hmm. So when my son moved out and went to college, and we had done all of these things to prepare him and get him out, and I was so broken the first time that we got together to have dinner with him afterward. He just behaved horribly to me. He was super insulting and mad and just hostile, and just really aggressive and angry. And I had no idea where that was coming from. And I was really sad, and I talked with my friend Evelyn about it, and she listened like a good friend would, just let me get it all out. And then she said, but you know what? You're the grown-up and you're the mom, and it's up to you to maintain that relationship, because he's a kid and he's acting out all of his stress at the place where he feels safest. So it really doesn't matter that he hurt your feelings. You call him and you fix it.
Yeah.
She is absolutely right. And there are very few people in my life that would have
I can tell you that.
have said it to me, you know, but a spiritual friend can do that. So one of the other ways that you can kind of make an assessment of your spiritual friends to get a sense of, well, what do I need in a spiritual friend? You can make a list that says friends for the heart, for the head, for the hand, and for the soul. And so I'll say that again. Friends for the heart, for the head, and as you guys know, I'm gonna email you guys tomorrow with like a little write-up of all of this. Friends for the heart, for the head, for the hand, for the soul. Is we need people that give us intellectual stimulation. I have my friends that are really smart, and they, you know, we can use the same kind of language and vocabulary as a shorthand because we've studied similar things. Friends for the heart, like, you know, I have, you know, there's different kinds of intelligences, right? I don't go to my husband, the engineer, and expect him to get the nuances of my heart, right? That'd be a really weird thing for me to do.
I'm sorry. We all love Mike, but yeah, you're right.
I understand.
Right?
I too am married to an engineer. I hear you.
And I love him, and I know that he loves me, but I'm not going to ask something of him that is beyond, you know, his capability.
Yep.
Friends for the hand, like I have my people that I do stuff with, right? I have people who might think the same things that I do. They might be able to be there for me emotionally and all of that. But if they don't want to go do the same stuff that I do, then, you know, or they're not really big into service and serving in that way, then I'm going to need that in my life, right? And then friends for the soul, somebody that I can just be completely bare in front of and talk to them about what's really going on with me and the Lord. And people who can help me identify God in my life. So those are a couple of things that you can take on this week. And I hope that those practices bless you and challenge you. And I hope that you find good spiritual friendships. And I hope that this is a place where we can continue to be good spiritual friends to one another. Can I pray for us before we go?
Yes, Mother.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Father, thank you so much for being with us in our conversation, for being present with us, even online, for being our steady person, our friend, who is there no matter what, that you are faithful even when we are not, and that you are our source of forgiveness and strength, no matter what we've done, no matter what we've left undone. We ask that you continue to be our revelation, just like you were at that place on the seashore. Lord, maybe this week we can just take an imaginary walk with you and imagine what you would say to us on that seashore. What is it that we need to talk with you about? Places where we have maybe betrayed you or ourselves or one another. Lord, I ask that you get that charcoal fire going and prepare a place where we can break our fast and have communion with one another. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
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 All right, you all be well. And I will see you next week. We are going to discuss, we're going to the mountaintop. We go with the 11 disciples on the mountain where we get the Great Commission. So we'll be talking about that next week.
Cool.
I have a
All right.
quick question.
See you in a few minutes.
I have a quick
Yes,
question.
thank you, Patrick, for doing that. All right, I'm gonna,
Patrick, thank you, Mother.
thank you. All
Good
right.
night, all.
Good night.
Good
I
night.
had a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.